Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy and this is Disciple Makers. This is a place where we are courageously striving to multiply followers of Jesus Christ. In my journey following Jesus, there has been so many times where I have seen Him do these remarkable things in my life. Provide in ways that I didn't believe could be provided for. Things that are just so obviously God's work in my life. But what often happens is as time passes, I forget this past thing that God remarkably worked in my life that could help me in this present thing. That thing that would help give me courage, that would help me not to fear, to help me not have anxiety in this new situation, that I could fully in faith trust that just as God worked here, He's going to work here too. One of the beautiful things about a discipleship relationship is it reminds us that we are better together than we are alone. And it helps us in relationship to remember, to pay attention to the ways God was at work in the past that will help us to work, for Him to work in us and through us in the present. In discipleship, we can remind each other, say, hey, how did God work in a situation like this in the past? Could He do that again? Should we be praying that He works in that way now today as you're walking through this? And it's so beautiful that we could have one another to do that. In the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, it records two miracles that were so shockingly similar. There's one that's referred to as the feeding of 5,000, which really was 5,000 men, presumably 5,000 women, presumably up to tens of thousands of kids. Jesus takes a couple loaves of bread and a few fish and turns it in enough to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. It was this miracle upon miracles. And then a little bit of time later, fast forward to chapter 8, which probably less than a year, maybe even just a couple of months, even a couple of weeks passes. And a similar situation arrives. There's a bunch of people that need to be fed, and there's not enough food to go around. And so Jesus asks, how much food do we have? And the disciples are like, I don't know. So this is like a perfect example of what I so often do in my life. That there's this past situation that Jesus so clearly worked and did this amazing, remarkable thing. Some time passes and I'm going through something similar and I'm like, I don't know if Jesus is going to show up this time. I don't know if He can work in the same way this time. And the same thing happened. But Jesus asked His disciples one simple question that I think is a question we should ask each other all the time in discipleship relationships. He says, and don't you remember? Don't you remember? Don't you remember when I turned a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish into enough to feed 5,000 men, women, children? Don't you think that I could do that again here? Don't you remember this time when I was at work? Don't you think I can do that again? Don't you think that you should enter this situation without fear, and instead with courage and trust to know God can work here just as He worked here? And so, disciple makers, as we are discipling, we need to help each other to remember what God has done in the past. And it will help us to process and understand how God is going to work here and now. How God is going to give us courage to not be afraid, to trust in Him, because He has been faithful in the past and He will be faithful in the present. And so, as we are in discipleship, help us to remember to ask one another, to remember what God has done, to pay attention to what God has done in the past. So disciple makers, let's go keep making disciples.